April 7th, 1945, the largest battleship ever built in human history rolled a few degrees to port and vanished beneath the East China Sea, taking with her the last realistic hope that the Imperial Japanese Navy could impose its will upon the Pacific. The loss of Yamato, the hotel castle, the dreadnought meant to terrify adversaries by bulk alone, was not a single bad day at sea. It was the arithmetic of an entire war coming due. Japan's naval command had spent years trying to fix the war with a decisive strike. What finally arrived instead was a decisive realization. The enemy's navy was not in the hundreds of thousands, it was in the millions, and growing faster than Japan could count. Across the 20th century's Central Ocean, American naval power had been building a momentum that was both visible and invisible. Visible in the endless lines of hulls sliding down greased ways at Newport News, Bath Iron Works, Mare Island, and Puget Sound. Invisible in personnel ledgers, training pipelines, and the expanding corps of seamen whose jobs stretched far beyond gunnery and navigation. The Imperial General Headquarters could spot a new carrier or cruiser in reconnaissance photos. It was far harder to see the human mass that animated those ships, the careful choreography of crews, replenishment specialists, aviation ordnancemen, signalmen, medics, and machinists' mates, who together made a navy something more than a list of tonnages. Japan's war plan had always leaned on a belief held since Tsushima, that a maritime war could be decided by one or two sharp, annihilating engagements. If the enemy could be coerced into trading losses at unfavorable ratios, political will would bend and the seas would tilt toward the empire. That logic had worked in 1905 against a Russian fleet that sailed far and fought tired. But in the 1940s, against an industrial continent mobilized by attack and led by admirals who understood how to compound advantages, it was a misreading that grew more dangerous as the days advanced. In 1941, when the war began for the United States, the Navy had under 300,000 personnel on the rolls. The specific figure for that December was roughly 284,000 in uniform, before the shock of Pearl Harbor forced the nation into total mobilization. Within 1 year, the Navy more than doubled. Within 2, it had nearly septupled. By 1944, Navy personnel stood at just under 3 million, and in 1945 it would peak above 3.3 million, a number that was not just a count of sailors, but of an ecosystem built to sustain modern naval warfare on a planetary scale. Those numbers tell the story more starkly than any dispatch. Every increase in headcount meant hundreds more instructors, thousands more deckhands, and the staff to operate new radar sets and decode enemy signals. It meant watch sections so thickly manned that a ship damaged today might be battle-ready tomorrow, with fresh hands rotated forward. It meant a steadily rising share of the Navy composed of reservists, the citizen sailors called up from factories, farms, and campuses, so that by the climax of the war, the United States Naval Reserve formed the overwhelming bulk of the active duty fleet's manpower. In May 1945, roughly 9 out of every 10 sailors on active duty wore reserve insignia. Japanese intelligence tried to map this expansion, but it was like charting a tide by watching the froth at the shoreline. They could not count the classrooms, the training carriers on the Great Lakes, the air groups that spent months rehearsing deck cycles, and the logistical squadrons that learned to turn a blue plane into a moving, self-sustaining city. They saw ships and searched for a point where replacement could not keep up with attrition. The point never arrived. The adversary was not just replacing lost hulls and crews, he was multiplying both.
American shipyards offer a blunt index of the change. Before the war, the Navy measured time in years between major combatant deliveries. By 1943, months became the unit. By 1944, sometimes weeks. Escort carriers, those compact, utilitarian baby flat tops that ferried planes, guarded convoys, and extended air cover across empty seas, were turned out by the score. The United States would commission more than 100 of these by war's end, forming a lattice of airfields at sea that stitched together operations from the Aleutians to the Sullivans. The production tempo was not limited to carriers. Destroyers, destroyer escorts, cruisers, submarines, fleet oilers, ammunition ships, repair ships, all the unglamorous types that make a fleet nimble and durable, poured off ways. So much so that by the autumn of 1945, the U.S. Navy possessed a majority of the world's tonnage in ships over 1,000 tons.
Navy personnel growth and shipbuilding expansion were not independent variables. Each required the other. A new Essex-class carrier represented not just a hull, but 3,000 to 3,500 billets. Aviation support, engineering, gun crews, and command. Multiply that by dozens of flat tops. Add the screens and auxiliaries that allowed those carriers to operate at long range, and the required manpower surges into the millions. This is why headcounts matter. The Imperial Japanese Navy, facing shortages of fuel and pilots, could not keep pace with that human arithmetic. Every time it gambled on decisive attacks at Santa Cruz, at the Philippine Sea, off Cape Engano, it wrote checks against a dwindling account. By the spring of 1945, the Pacific Fleet Organization looked like a cathedral of steel. Task Force 58, fast carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers could refuel and rearm at sea and return to the fight in a rhythm that seemed mechanical. Sortie, strike, recover, replenish, and repeat. When Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz needed to shift from Fifth Fleet to Third Fleet constructs, he did so in days, not months, because the staff, the ships, and the people existed to perform the swap without loss of tempo. One cannot understand April 1945 without that architecture of command and supply. The Japanese Navy, watching this machine grind forward, sought ways to invalidate the American advantage. Aircraft and pilots were the limiting reagents, and so destructive ingenuity supplied an answer: special attack. The intention was brutally clear. If numbers could not be matched, shock might compensate. Kamikaze missions represented a choice born of scarcity. Throw the plane and the man as a single weapon at the massive targets that stood offshore. In certain operations, this imposed real costs. Off Okinawa, the U.S. fleet endured harrowing days. Yet even there, the operational logic remained unforgiving. The Americans had built and manned a fleet that could be struck and struck again and still carry on. Fuel lines held. Repair ships steamed up to smoldering holes and began work. Air groups rotated pilots. The numbers absorbed shock. This is the context for the final sortie of Yamato and her small escort. Operation 10 Go was less a naval plan than a national gesture. Yamato had enormous guns and a heroic crew. She did not have air cover, fuel for a round trip, or a way to hide in oceans dominated by radar-equipped scouts and ultra-long-range combat air patrols. On April 7, 1945, American carrier aviators found her, fixed her position, and attacked again and again. Bombs and torpedoes walked up and down the battleship's flanks. Watertight integrity faltered. Counter-flooding could not keep pace with damage. When her magazines erupted, the shock was visible from miles away.
It was the last grand exhalation of the battleship era in the Pacific. What ended with Yamato was not merely a ship's story, but a strategic illusion. For 3.5 years, Japanese planners had oscillated between two ways of seeing the United States Navy: a countable list of formations and a cultural adversary whose will might be broken. The first count was always incomplete. The second misjudgment was fatal. American will did not stand apart from its factories and training stations. It grew with them. Each new class of naval aviators returned from practice fields in Kansas and Michigan. Each new intake of machinists' mates reported from Norfolk and Great Lakes. Each wave of reservists, lawyers, teachers, engineers, students swapped civilian clothes for uniforms and learned to run boiler rooms, plot gunnery solutions, and splice lines. By 1945, the Navy had become a national institution with a global mission and a scale that no opponent could match that year. The Imperial Japanese Navy's intelligence culture, meanwhile, was shaped by both excellence and blind spots. Pre-war attachés were skilled observers. Japanese naval cryptanalysts achieved successes in the 1930s. Operational scouting forces did heroic work with the tools available. Yet the system struggled with confirmation bias and with a bureaucratic tendency to pass enemy capability through the lens of expected decisive battle. The result was periodic underestimations, estimations that imagined American naval manpower in the hundreds of thousands, even as the real numbers accelerated past 2 million and then 3. The consequence was not merely analytical error. It was operational design that assumed a brittle opponent. When the opponent bent but did not break, the strategy had no adjustment left to make. On the American side, the official record of personnel growth is precise. Navy strength rose from 284,000 in 1941 to 640,570 in 1942, to 1.74 million in 1943, to 2.98 million in 1944, and to 3.38 million in 1945.
Consider the experience of a single task group in 1945. A fast carrier task force might place a dozen flight decks within mutual support. Under those decks worked thousands of black gang engineers, aviation bosun's mates, ordnance crews, and radar operators, each trained to a speciality that did not exist in the navies of 1915. When sorties recovered, a choreography began. Aircraft rolled forward for rearming. Tanks were topped off, bomb trucks scurried, armorers worked under the wings, flight directors signaled. The deck crews turned a chaos of prop wash and jet of steam into a timed wave of launches. This was a human art. One does not improvise it with thin crews. It is the work of a service that has the manpower to train, the deliberate depth to absorb casualties, and the foresight to recruit ahead of need. Depth, the decisive quality so often overlooked in wartime estimates, showed itself in logistics. Fleet oilers, deemed unromantic but vital, kept operations moving at pace. Ammunition ships turned around rapidly. Repair ships carried machine shops and foundries in their hulls, so a damaged destroyer might leave a forward anchorage hours after limping in. Submarines patrolled with excellent torpedoes by 1944-45, guided by a hardened doctrine and supported by a command structure that had learned how to apportion targets. Every one of those functions required people, not a handful at each billet, but battalions and brigades of specialists across the theater. This is what the headcounts imply, not just a big navy, but a navy with a staff for everything it needed to do. The contrast with Japan was stark and painful. Fuel shortages forced training flights to be cut. Veteran pilots were rotated into teaching roles only to discover there was too little gasoline to train their replacements. Shipyard repairs lagged as bombing campaigns bit deeper into industrial arteries. By 1945, the Navy that had struck so brilliantly at Pearl Harbor was living on technical invention and bravado rather than on replenishment. Kamikaze operations reflected courage and tragedy. They also reflected the math of scarcity. A plane and a man expended per strike was not something a constrained system could sustain while also fighting the air control battle against fast carriers. When the home islands finally had to stare at the numbers, there was no romance left in the accounting. The enemy's sailor was not a single archetype on a distant bridge. He was millions of men and women arrayed across duties on sea and ashore, whose collective competence turned the Pacific into an American operating theater. In 1945, the Navy's headcount alone, 3,380,817, was greater than the pre-war total active duty strength of the entire U.S. Armed Forces by a wide margin. Within that figure were the Navy Nurse Corps, the Waves, the Seabees building forward bases at a tempo that kept fleets fueled and fed, and 1,000 other roles that converted metal into power.
This is not to claim that numbers alone won the Pacific War. Courage mattered, doctrine mattered, intelligence mattered, code breaking, radio direction finding, photographic interpretation. The geometry of carrier warfare, mastered painfully in 1942 and methodically refined in 1943–45, mattered immensely. But numbers turn courage into victory when courage survives day after day. The Imperial Navy fought with ferocity at Guadalcanal and in the Slot, at the Santa Cruz Islands and the Bismarck Sea. It scored painful blows, and American memorials testified to that cost. Yet, from 1943 onward, every American loss could be met with replacements that arrived trained and equipped to modern standards. From 1944 onward, many losses were absorbed without operational pause. The American Naval Reserve component underlines this point. By late war, reservists on active duty formed upwards of 4/5 to 9/10 of the Navy's personnel. The country had mobilized bankers to navigate by stars and graduates to repair turbines. A democracy's latent strength, its human capital, had been translated into naval proficiency at breathtaking speed. One can feel the policy implications echo through later decades. If a state can expand its trained naval manpower by an order of magnitude in 3 years, then any war of exhaustion fought against it on open oceans is a wager against compounding growth. The Imperial Navy's planners wagered that this growth would be unsustainable, that morale would crack, that the ledger would balance in their favor with a climactic blow. The ledger, it turned out, was a living document, and the other side kept adding lines.
And yet, to see the end purely as a lesson in statistics is to flatten the human experience behind those numbers. The Navy's casualty rolls carried tens of thousands of names. The stories of ships like Indianapolis remind us that even a juggernaut bleeds, and bleeds terribly. Survivors tell of days and nights that should temper triumph with humility. The arithmetic of victory is not clean. It is stained by memory, lament, and the costs that do not end with an armistice. But the arithmetic still speaks. The side that could field, train, and sustain millions of naval personnel, that built a fleet which could repair itself while fighting, that deployed mobile logistics powerful enough to feed whole task forces at sea, that side had already warped the decision space long before any surrender instrument lay on a battleship's table. The post-war accounting makes the case in a different register. Fleet Admiral Ernest J. King's final report summarized the breadth of what the Navy had done. Not just the battles won, but the system built to win them. One reads in those pages the sober pride of a service that understands its own transformation. A pre-war fleet, brave and small, refashioned into a global arm that could project power across hemispheres. If the Imperial Japanese Navy searched for the moment when victory slipped away, it might find it not in a battle line shattered or an anchorage burned, but in the quiet inevitability of training classes that began in 1942 and never stopped graduating sailors.
So it was that by the time Yamato sailed south into the gray, the decision was already written. American carriers launched in waves because they had the pilots and deck crews to spare. Destroyers screened because they were enough to rotate and relieve. Oilers pumped because crews learned the dangerous craft of refueling underway. Staffs planned because there were staffs to plan. Intelligence processed because reservists fluent in mathematics and languages had been found and trained. The barbarous churn of war had, by 1945, become a logistics problem that the United States knew how to solve faster than anyone else. Japan's admirals were not blind to this. They watched it unfold. And when they tried to measure their enemy by the old scale, by ships they could see and fighters they could count, they found a deeper figure, a navy whose size was measured in millions. The moral is not that numbers make right, or that industry is destiny. The moral is that in a modern maritime war, the decisive space is often behind the horizon. Warehouse floors, classrooms, medical wards, mess halls, berthing compartments, dry docks, and staff rooms. When a state can fill those spaces with trained, motivated people and link them into a fighting whole, its fleets move with the continuity of a tide. Against such continuity, single blows, even brilliant ones, cannot decide. The Imperial Japanese Navy had the courage and skill to attempt those blows. By 1945, however, it was facing a tide made of men and women who, in their millions, had learned the art of modern sea war.
If Japanese analysts had once imagined a United States Navy that could be beaten by attrition, hundreds of thousands of sailors dwindling ship by ship, they were overtaken by a fact that no staff study could domesticate. The numbers had passed into the millions, and the apparatus that produced them was still accelerating. The United States Navy in 1945 was not a target to surprise, but a machine to endure. Faced with that reality, Japan did what proud navies have always done. It fought to the last. But in a war ruled by production and personnel, fight and fate were no longer aligned. The enemy's head count was the verdict. History sometimes gives us neat epiphanies, a signal captured, a battle turned by a late-arriving squadron. The Pacific War's naval epiphany is stranger and in some ways grander. It is the realization that the weight of an industrial democracy, once mobilized, could generate a fleet whose human mass, training, logistics, reserves, redundancy, outstripped conventional imagination. By April 1945, as shock waves from Yamato's explosion rippled across the sea, that truth lay plain upon the water. The Pacific had been a proving ground not only for ships and planes, but for a people capable of crewing and sustaining them in numbers unimaginable at the war's start. And once that was understood, once it was counted, defeat ceased to be a possibility to avert and became, simply, the end already on its way.